The Legend of Zelda series is one of the most consistently incredible franchises in all of gaming, but that doesn't mean there isn't at least one flaw in each game. Some of these are minor nitpicks, while other are pretty sizable issues. Today I'll be going over what I, in my own opinion, believe to be the biggest flaw in every Zelda game. There's a special kind of charm to the original Legend of Zelda. You just spawn in an empty field, get handed a sword by an old man in a cave, and that's it. There's no tutorial, no dialogue, no objectives. Just you and a dangerous world waiting to be explored. It's pure freedom, and that's what makes it both legendary and also frustrating. Because here's the thing, this game gives you zero direction. You're supposed to just somehow know which random bush to burn, which wall to bomb, or which secret to stumble into by accident. It's not challenging in a traditional sense, it's just cryptic. I know there was the guide with a map, but even with that, there's a lack of any sort of objective, and it's just super confusing. Like, it's foundational and historic, and it deserves all the respect in the world, but its biggest flaw is that it's just too vague for its own good. Like, a little mystery is good, and you certainly don't want the game to hold your hand, but too much turns adventure into guesswork. There's no sugarcoating it, Zelda 2 is brutal. It's widely considered to be the worst game in the series, and except one 50-year-old saying my Zelda game ranking was invalid since I had it last, I very rarely see many people seriously defend this game. To Nintendo's credit, this game tried something bold. A side-scroller with experience points, towns, and spells. That's not something you expect from a direct sequel to an overhead dungeon crawler. It's weird, but it is also fascinating. Unfortunately, it's also punishingly difficult. You lose all your accumulated XP when you die, there's a limited life system, and if you get a game over, guess what? You're sent all the way back to the start of the game, just no checkpoints. No mercy! That kind of design discourages experimentation. You stop trying new spells or exploring risky areas because the cost of failure is just too high. Instead of adventure, you're just stuck in survival mode the whole time, and the combat, while interesting, has janky hitboxes and unfair enemy placement that makes every victory feel like you barely escaped with your sanity intact. You really go with either of those as the biggest flaw, and if some of these difficulties were optional, I think this game would be looked at a lot more fondly nowadays. If there's one game that defines Zelda for an entire generation and beyond, it's A Link to the Past. It perfected the formula with more themed dungeons, incredible pacing, and some of the best music on the Super Nintendo. A lot of people consider this to be the perfect video game, so it actually was pretty difficult to find the biggest flaw in this. Because it really is a near perfect formula, and I know there's some complaints about some of the bosses or dungeons, and someone has probably already commented proclaiming that as a fact that it's the biggest flaw, but I really think it's simple. The controls and UI are pretty wonky today. Hitboxes sometimes feel off, there's only one item box, and movement can feel slow. These are all more nitpicks and just personal gripes that you may not even have yourself. I feel like A Link to the Past is really a nearly flawless game for what it is, so that's why it is just a nitpick here. Link's Awakening is one of those games that shouldn't have worked. It's a full-scale Zelda adventure on the Game Boy in the early 90s, and yet somehow it not only worked, it became one of the most beloved entries in the series. It's funny, heartfelt, and deeply emotional. It's the kind of story that is surprisingly ambitious for the Game Boy. The biggest flaw here is how often the hardware gets in the way of the experience. The screen is tiny, the world is cramped, and every time you move from one area to another, the screen pauses to load the next. It breaks the sense of exploration that defines Zelda. Then there's the constant item swapping. Since you only have two buttons for gear, you'll be pausing every minute to switch between your sword, shield, feather, power bracelet. These are limitations of the platform, not the design, but they do matter. Link's Awakening tells a beautiful story, but its biggest flaw is that it's just bursting at the seams of its own hardware. Fortunately, the Switch remake completely fixes all these technical problems, so it's the definitive way to play this game by far. Ocarina of Time redefined 3D gaming, invented targeting systems, and set the bar for world design for an entire industry, and is widely considered to be one of the best video games of all time. It's a game that may have no major flaws, and I consider it to be basically perfect. And yes, I did say major flaw, because there are still a few things that aren't perfect here. So what do I consider to be the biggest issue with this game? It's the overworld. Not even the theme of it, as it's still iconic, but it just feels kind of barren, especially Hyrule Field. Sure, rolling around Hyrule Field might be fun for a bit, but it quickly gets tiring. Now, it's not fair to expect this game to have like Tears of the Kingdom level detail in its overworld where there's just a bunch of enemy encounters, quests, and other hidden secrets everywhere, but it really isn't one of Zelda's strongest. Also, I could go with the water temple because I think that's the worst part of the game, but it's not like a fundamental flaw, it's just one dungeon. Honestly, I could go with either one here. There's nothing else quite like Majora's Mask. It's weird, haunting, emotional, and arguably one of the most creative games Nintendo's ever made. It takes the foundation of Ocarina and builds something darker, a world where time itself is your enemy, and that's also kind of its biggest flaw, ironically. The 3-day time cycle is genius from a storytelling perspective. It gives the game rhythm and urgency, turning NPCs into schedules instead of static characters, but from a player's perspective, it can feel really restrictive. You're constantly fighting the clock, like you want to explore, but you're worried you'll run out of time. You want to help someone, but you realize their quest only happens on day 2. You can't just play, you have to plan, and that pressure can be exhausting. Some players love it, and it's what makes this game so distinct and rewarding. Others find it more stressful and just give up halfway through. So while Majora's Mask is an incredible experiment in atmosphere and structure, its biggest flaw is that it demands too much control from the player. Like, I really love Majora's Mask, and I do kind of like the system, so I even hesitate to call it a flaw, since it is also intentional, but it objectively does make this game more restrictive, which does kind of suck, because I feel like this is one of the most interesting worlds we've seen in a Zelda game.
If I had to choose one major flaw for Oracle's Seasons, it's how often you're forced to just maneuver the inventory. And I know I mentioned this issue before, and this is an issue with a few other games, but it was just really noticeable here. The Game Boy Color only lets you assign 2 items at a time, which means you're just constantly pausing to swap between the power bracelet, Rock's Feather, shovel, sword, and sometimes just every few seconds. And this game has other flaws, but when playing it, this is just what I noticed the most. It's not that the items themselves are bad, there are actually a lot of fun items to use here, but just the constant interruptions break the flow of combat and exploration, just making what should be a fast-paced adventure feel clunky. Seasons is all about momentum, and its control limitations keep getting in the way over and over again, and it was something that just got pretty distracting after a while. And this is such a minor issue that can be fixed, because if they remade this game, obviously you'd already have your sword and shield equipped at all times, and you'd get the additional 2 item spots, and it would be much easier to use. Now into the other Oracle game. It is one of the most ambitious 2D Zeldas ever made, but with that ambition comes a lot of frustration. Biggest flaw in my opinion is just so often it slips from clever just to tedious. Like whether it's navigating Jabu Jabu's belly, suffering through the Goron minigames, or just dealing with Crescent Island's item swapping, the game has a handful of moments that just feel more like endurance tests than puzzles. When Ages is good, it's a really great game, but when it's bad, it can grind your patience down. Like it's a game that demands a lot of commitment. Sometimes it just takes a little too much of your patience. Still a great game, but needs a remake.
If you've never played Four Swords, you're not alone, and that's kind of the entire problem. Bundled with the GBA version of A Link to the Past, Four Swords was Nintendo's first attempt at multiplayer Zelda, and on paper, it's really cool. Cooperative dungeon solving, shared loot, competitive chaos, it's everything you'd want in a couch co-op Zelda. But the biggest flaw is that a lot of people just couldn't play it. You needed multiple Game Boy Advances, multiple Link cables, and friends who also owned both. In 2002, that setup was like trying to perform a LAN party ritual with rare artifacts you found in Castletown. Even when you did get it running, it was short and somewhat disjointed compared to traditional Zeldas. It's a fun experiment to find ridiculous hardware requirements. Four Swords was ahead of its time, but it's also the definition of a good idea with a bad execution. A game that literally locked itself away from the majority of its audience. Like, you can play it now on Switch, but it has really shown its age, and I also just don't think it's a great game on its own, so I don't know how many people are actually going back and playing this with 3 other people. The Wind Waker is one of those games that went from controversial to beloved over time. When it launched, people complained about the cel-shaded visuals, and now those visuals are what make it timeless. But even with that redemption arc, there's still one flaw that nearly everyone agrees on: the Triforce Shard quest. You reach the end of the sweeping, emotional journey, the world is falling apart, Ganondorf's presence looms over every wave, and suddenly, the game tells you to stop and go treasure hunting. You need to find the 8 Triforce shards scattered across the Great Sea, each hidden behind charts that require rupees to decode. It just kills the pacing of this game. What was a thrilling race to the finish becomes just a long checklist of fetch quests and sailing segments across mostly empty ocean space. And speaking of that ocean, it's beautiful, but it's also as empty as Sticker Star's combat. The world feels huge, but not particularly alive. Islands are small and often repetitive, and the constant sailing can feel like autopilot between the fun parts. It's still a great experience with one of the best stories and endings in the series, and this is personally a top 4 or 5 Zelda game for me, but this is definitely a pretty big flaw. Just when you're ready to go into the finale, it just forces you to tread water, quite literally. After the limited success of Four Swords, Nintendo decided to double down and give the multiplayer idea a proper spotlight with Four Swords Adventures on the GameCube. And honestly, it's a blast, at least it could be, if you could actually get it working. The concept is brilliant once again, a full-length Zelda experience you can play cooperatively, blending traditional exploration with mini-level objectives. But then comes the catch. Every player needed their own Game Boy Advance and a link cable to connect it to the GameCube, so just like with its predecessor, this was still pretty difficult to play. For a lot of players, that made this game basically unplayable in its intended form. Playing solo was possible, but nowhere near as fun, and the game's mission-based format stripped away the sense of open-world discovery Zelda's known for. So while there's a lot of charm and creativity here, its flaw is once again its hardware barrier. Now, this is a game that doesn't get talked about enough. The Minish Cap is one of the most charming entries in this entire franchise. It's colorful, whimsical, and packed with personality thanks to Eslo, the talking hat with an attitude. But if you played it, you probably know its biggest issue. It just feels like something's missing. The world is delightful but small, the dungeon count is on the shorter side, and just when it feels like the adventure is starting to ramp up, it ends. The fusion system, where you trade kinstones with NPCs to unlock secrets, is clever at first, but quickly becomes tedious padding. It's like the game is begging you to artificially extend its runtime through busy work. And it's really a shame because everything else here, like the visuals, the combat, the music, is top notch, but the Minish Cap's biggest flaw is that it just leaves you wanting more, and not in a good way. It's still a gem of a Game Boy Advance game, but it's just something that feels like it needed maybe one more dungeon or some more content to truly shine, and I hope we get a remake someday that really brings this game's full potential out. Twilight Princess was marketed as the dark, gritty, mature Zelda that fans have been asking for since the Space World 2000s demo, and in many ways, it delivered. The dungeons are some of the most creative in the series, Mina is one of the most compelling companions in any game, and the world feels massive. But before you can enjoy any of that, you have to slog through the opening hours, and I mean hours. It doesn't just start slow, it starts as slow as Nintendo adapting to industry standards. You spend multiple segments herding goats, learning how to fish, and performing fetch quests before the adventure even begins, and when it finally does, you're thrown into another slow-paced tutorial section as Wolf Link collecting Tears of Light. Once it opens up, it's incredible. The dungeon design, the music, the emotional storytelling. But those early hours test your patience. It's like sitting through a 2-hour opening act watching some awful band before seeing your favorite group actually perform. So while Twilight Princess is a phenomenal adventure once it gets going, its biggest flaw is just its pacing. It mistakes slow build for slow burn, and that intro may be one of the longest tutorials in gaming history. When the DS came out, Nintendo had a golden opportunity to reimagine Zelda for touch controls, and Phantom Hourglass did exactly that. Drawing your route on the map, controlling the boomerang with precision, solving puzzles with stylus inputs, it all felt new and interesting at first. Then you realize that the game's main dungeon, the Temple of the Ocean King, is something you'll be revisiting over and over and over again. Each time you go deeper, but you also have to replay sections you've already cleared, dodging invincible guards while on a timer. It's not bad once or twice, but by the 5th visit, it just starts to feel like a chore. You know what to do, the game just keeps making you do it again. And that's the biggest flaw in my opinion. Phantom Hourglass has tons of charm and some really clever puzzles, but the repetition kills the pacing. Like, the ocean exploration is fun, the characters are great, but the structure keeps throwing you back into the same place again and again, like a Zelda-themed Groundhog Day. And I know some people are gonna bring up the touch controls also, and yeah, those aren't my favorite, but I think this was really what brought the game down compared to the touch controls. On paper, the concept is fun. You're a trained engineer exploring a kingdom connected by magical railways, solving puzzles, and teaming up with the Ghost Zelda. But in practice, that railway system ends up being too restrictive. You can't freely explore Hyrule like in past games, you're locked to set track, and combat encounters happen in narrow, repetitive sequences. The game has a lot of charm once again. Zelda as a ghost companion is genuinely delightful, and music is some of the best in the DS era, but the feeling of confinement never quite goes away. You're constantly just following paths instead of making them. It's a rare case where this game's central gimmick works against the very heart of what Zelda's supposed to be, which is freedom. Spirit Tracks is creative, but its biggest flaw is that it just turned the adventure into something that really wasn't much of an adventure. You're exploring a world, but only in the way the train schedule allows. And it's still a very good game. I think it's better than Phantom Hourglass, but I just think that the DS hardware kind of held back what Nintendo was going for here. Skyward Sword is often a game I really do enjoy, but it is a very divisive game in the Zelda community. Look at my Zelda ranking, there's people saying it's a bottom 5 game and people saying it's a top 5 game. And of course people getting mad at me because I didn't go with their opinion. There's some technical flaws like the janky motion controls, which would luckily be fixed in the Switch remaster, but the biggest flaw in my opinion is just how linear it is. Every area, every dungeon, every side quest, it's all meticulously guided. There's no true exploration, no surprises. The world is divided into segments and you're told exactly what to do in each one. Even Fee, your ever-present companion, can't help herself from explaining every puzzle before you even try it. The sense of mystery, the soul of Zelda, gets buried under constant hand-holding, and when you finally think you're done with an area, the game sends you back for another slightly altered version of the same task. Now, it's a beautiful game trapped inside its own structure. It's full of potential, but just afraid to let go of the player's hand. Once again, this is a great game. Like, I think this is arguably a top 10 Zelda game, because the linear design is still very good. It's just not really what we're looking for out of a 3D Zelda. After nearly 2 decades of following the same formula, A Link Between Worlds broke tradition in all the right ways. You could rent items in any order, tackle dungeons however you wanted, and roam the world freely. Refreshing throwback to the original Legend of Zelda, but with all that freedom came a new issue. The game's difficulty and tension took a nosedive, because you can rent almost every item from the start. There's never that thrill of slowly earning new tools or the fear of failure. Since there really is no set order, the difficulty has trouble balancing itself. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom kind of have this too, but I feel like it just kind of works better there. It's still an amazing game, but the stakes just aren't really there. Ironic that I'm complaining about a game being too open after talking about a couple of games being too linear. I just think that it could have been a better way to try and balance this, if that makes sense. Triforce Heroes should have been the perfect follow-up to the Forward Swords idea, a cooperative puzzle-solving adventure on the 3DS with style, humor, and personality. And it is fun, if you happen to have exactly 2 other friends, stable internet, and patience. The game's biggest flaw is that it's just not really a Zelda game, or at least it doesn't feel like one. Unlike the Four Swords games where it was just really difficult to play with someone, it really isn't that difficult because you just need 2 other people. The 3DS didn't need cables, you could play online. And yeah, like I said, it's maybe not the easiest thing to find 2 other people who play this, but at least for me personally, I was able to play a lot of this game with 2 friends, but the dungeons just don't really feel that great. Like, they feel like watered down. There's absolutely nothing to do outside of the dungeons. Like, you literally just get costumes. And I kind of like the concept of this, but I feel like they could have done a lot more with it. Also, another flaw that wasn't too big for me since I didn't really play online that much with random people is that there's no way to say specific things. Like, you get like a few dialogue options and that's it. When Breath of the Wild dropped, it didn't just reinvent Zelda, it reinvented open world games as a whole. The physics engine, the freedom, the sense of scale. It's arguably the most revolutionary Nintendo title since Ocarina of Time, but even perfection has its blind spots. The biggest flaw here is the lack of traditional dungeons and meaningful rewards. Yeah, the shrines are fun and plentiful, but they all share the same sterile aesthetic and short puzzle format. Gone are the grand thematic dungeons that really made Zelda games so special. The forest temples, Snowhead Peaks, the stone towers, the divine beasts just tried to fill that role, but they ended up feeling repetitive and mechanically similar, and all looked exactly the same on the inside. Like, can you really tell these apart? It's still one of the greatest games ever made, but Breath of the Wild's biggest flaw is just that it took one of the things Zelda is most known for in dungeons, and it barely had them, and what it did have was just not very good. Like, they even basically shared the same boss. When Tears of the Kingdom launched, expectations were sky high. I guess you could say almost as high as the Sky Islands. And to its credit, it somehow met them. It expanded on Breath of the Wild's foundation with new building mechanics, a bigger world, and a stronger narrative core, which has some flaws with itself, just being very vague about a lot of things, but I don't think that's the biggest issue. For me, its biggest flaw is just its familiarity. For all its innovation, it still feels tethered to the exact same structure as its predecessor. The same map, the same shrine concept, and once again, it's like kind of 4 or 5 dungeons if you want to consider like the ending to be its own dungeon. It's a masterpiece of refinement rather than reinvention, but in a series built on constant evolution, it just makes it feel a little less magical. Now, it's still incredible, and in my opinion, one of the best games ever made. And while there is still a lot of new stuff here, the same main overworld is basically the same here, and that feeling you got from exploring Breath of the Wild for the first time just isn't here unless you didn't play Breath of the Wild. And finally, we reach Echoes of Wisdom, the most recent addition to the Zelda lineage, and the first mainline game to star Princess Zelda herself. It's a bold, refreshing concept, and the new ecosystem that lets you copy objects and enemies to solve puzzles is generally pretty clever. It feels a lot different than every other Zelda game, and it's good to see Nintendo still experiment with 2D games in the series. However, it definitely has some notable flaws. One being the frame rate, which can get pretty choppy on Switch. Another being the dialogue feeling kind of off, but for me the biggest flaw was just the lack of combat. Like, combat has never been the most impressive thing about 2D Zelda, but I just felt it really lacked here. It's not lacking in detail, but it feels more like a puzzle, and it just really didn't hit for me. I know some people really love it, but I just prefer the quicker combat in other Zelda games. And that's what I believe to be the biggest flaw in every Zelda game. You're probably going to disagree with me, and that's fine. This is just what I noticed, like, playing all of these games, the biggest flaw for me. And I want to know in the comments what you think the biggest flaw in every Zelda game is. If you enjoyed this, be sure to like and subscribe, and consider joining my Discord and becoming a channel member for just a couple bucks a month. Thank you for watching Domainy, and I'll see you next time.